So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about the Univega Alpina 503 mountain bike. There's a few features of this that I really think are important to mountain biking history and cycling generally. You see them in some other bikes. You see them kind of all together in this one. So, firstly, why is this facing drive side backwards? Usually, when you present a bike, if you care at all, you have it with the drivetrain side facing out. So the side that has the chain, the gears, all that stuff. Yes, because people like to be able to see what kind of gears it has and what your chainring setup is and that sort of thing. In this case, however, I wanted to show you really more about the frame, and there's some features in the frame that the chain rings kind of cover up. So we'll start with the front end of the bike. Basically, set the stage, it's now the mid-1990s. If I recollect, this is a 95. I might be off by like a year, but it's very hard to look up things about these. It's kind of funny, I've looked up things about this bike, and some people say it's a 96, some people say it's a 95. It's hard to narrow it down exactly. I'm pretty sure it's a 95, but again, it could go like a year either way. The problem is they made several variations of each. So. But it's now the mid-1990s to set the stage, and the frame geometry, the incredibly lax head tube angles and cruiser-like ride of some of the early mountain bikes from the, let's say, early 1980s, that's kind of a thing of the past now. So they're starting to get a little more modern, but there's still some things about the bike and bikes generally in this time period that are we would consider anachronistic. So you'll notice it's got a threadless steerer, which is again a move towards a more modern technology, but the threadless steerer is 1 inch. Yeah, they went to a new type of headset, but essentially they left the frame materials and tubing they were using the same, and just didn't thread the steerer. If you want to change the way you attach the fork to the frame, as long as you don't change the size of the tubing, there's not necessarily any reason to change where you buy your steel tubing from and the setup of your jig and all of that. So I guess this was a way of maintaining ease of manufacturing, and frankly, 1 inch had been, or variations of 1 inch had been used in cycling for literally 100 years at this point, and I don't think anybody really thought, well, what's the point of changing? Of course, they went to 1 1/8 eventually. Of course, there was an intermediary size of 1 1/4, I think, and then now you have tapered steerer tubes where the bottom set of bearings is actually a different size than the top. So, the joke's on you. Just when you got used to the 1 1/8, boom, we're going to change it. But for the time, 1 inch was sufficient, and the only modernization was to the method of attaching the fork through the frame to the stem. An interesting thing about this, because this has cantilever brakes instead of V brakes or linear pull brakes as they call them, you need a cable stop up here somewhere or somewhere down here. A lot of course, suspension forks that were designed with the idea that somebody could mount cantilever brakes will have a cable guide on the fork, because of course, if you have it up here somewhere on the frame and the fork is, the length of the fork is fluctuating due to its travel as you're going over bumps, that's going to be changing the tension on your brake cable. So you don't want it up here if you're going to have a suspension fork, but with a rigid fork, it's okay to have it up here. And this bike has a cable guide up here. Now what's interesting is this cable guide, to keep it from sliding around, normally on a threaded headset, these would tend to just have a notch in it, because the threads on the threaded headset had a ridge going up. They weren't concentric threads. They kind of went all the way around and then stopped, and there was a groove, not a ridge rather, a groove going up, and then there would be a corresponding ridge on the inside of either the washer that went between the two nuts and the threaded headset, or the if there was one of these, usually there was one of these either instead of a washer, or to help it index and keep it straight, it would have the same little tab as the washer did to fit in that groove. Anyway, this doesn't have a threaded headset, so there's no groove. So how are you going to keep this centered so it doesn't just slide around? Well, what they went with was having a pinch bolt here. So this thing is slid at the front, and there's a bolt that goes through and threads into the other side and causes it to squeeze around the steer tube. Kind of more or less exactly the same how you have the handlebar stem attached, except the bolts at the front instead of the back. Now what this means is that if you have this tight enough to keep it centered, if you have to adjust your stem or even completely swap your stem for whatever reason, you decided you don't like the size, you're getting older, you want a more upright stem, you're doing more aggressive riding, you want a more lower stem, whatever. If you loosen the headset to take the stem off, you do not lose your headset adjustment because you have this cable stop here that's tightened down independently, which is interesting. And I've often wondered why, because that's one of the problems with a threaded headset, is that whenever you adjust your headset or tinker with your headset, you end up completely messing up the adjustment of your, I should say, whenever you adjust the stem or alter the stem, you end up altering the adjustment of the headset. They're not independent. But this one, it kind of is, because you've got this little cable stop here that keeps the headset tight even if you remove the stem, take it off completely. Well, it's kind of funny. I was talking about that the other day to a friend of mine. He pointed out, well, back in the day, you actually did have something to independently keep the headset tight if you remove the stem. And basically what they had, I forget what it was called, but it was like the exact same design as this cable stop, except without the cable stop. It was like a spacer that had a slit in it with a pinch bolt. And literally, it would do the same thing. It would keep it tightened down, whether you know. I thought that was interesting, amongst other things. But yeah, they went to a threadless headset, which only avoids the major downside of a threadless headset by accident, because this particular one has cantilever brakes and they needed a cable stop. And how do you do that on a threadless steerer? Well, you have it bolt and clamp in place. Well, and surprise, now your headset will stay adjusted even if you remove your stem. Well, okay, so this is a threadless setup without the one downside of a threadless setup, which I think is kind of cool. But yeah, it's a threadless 1-inch setup. Right? Moving back on the frame, we've got a interesting just side note. There's water bottle mounts on this frame, obviously given the time period. Now you're lucky to find one, but this has a full complement of two, and then an extra one underneath like a touring bike, which is kind of interesting. So you've got water bottle mount on a seat tube, on a down tube, and then on the underside of the down tube. You also have a sloping top tube, not dramatically sloping, it's not radically curved or anything, but slightly sloping. And all the cables are routed along the top tube here. You don't have any cable routing on the down tube. So one of the reasons they stopped doing that on mountain bikes a long time ago is because there'd be a tendency for mud or dried leaves or things to collect, either get in the space between the cable and the housing, or just collect against the frame under the cables, or get crud sticking to the cables. It wasn't considered good. It was, up here they're out of the way, they're less likely to get fouled by dirt or debris. But what's interesting is about the way they put them up here. There's 3 cables. One goes here on the bottom edge of the tube along the side. One goes here on the top edge of the tube along the side. And the other one on the other side goes along the top edge of the tube along the side. There's nothing underneath. So if you were to, let's say, shoulder the bike to climb up some stairs or over a stream or whatever, there's nothing underneath to rub on your shoulder. No cables, no cable stops, because they're on the sides. They're on the, if you could imagine the top tube was square cross section instead of round. Of course it's round, but if you could imagine it being square, they're on the corners. That's how they're oriented. So there's nothing underneath, which is, it's just really well thought out. Then the rear seat stays come up. They attach higher, slightly higher than um, the top tube, because it is a sloping top tube. This gives you full length seat stays, even though, I mean, I guess you could have the seat stays just go right to the lower point, but this gives you a little bit more. You'll notice that this part of the frame sticks up a little bit. That would maybe be a little weak without the chain stays going up to it. If the chain stays attached here, then that would just be sticking up on its own. Well, the chain stays go all the way up to there. So it does have some reinforcement in the back. And now we come to the part of the frame which is really, really funky, and that's this thing here. You'll notice where you've got the seat stays up here in the top tube. Now down here you've got the down tube going into the bottom bracket. We come to the first thing about this frame that really, really stands out. The down tube is not a uniform round shape. It's ovalized, and the ovalization changes depending on where you are in a down tube. So right here at the top, where the down tube leaves the head tube, it's squished in at the sides. So it's tall this way and it's narrower on the sides. That gives you more material here to resist stress this way. Then you go down the down tube, it rounds out more to a standard round diameter, and then when you get towards the bottom bracket, it's ovalized the other way. So at the top it's like this, at the bottom it's like this, and it's round in the middle. Now of course this gives you more resistance against side-to-side stresses, which, with the bottom bracket and the pedals being down there and the cranks, that kind of makes sense too. Then as you leave the bottom bracket, you get into something really, really, really funky, which is what actually really makes this bike stand out for me. And that's this. Let me move this down here. Okay. Check this out. The stays are just, wow. So your chain stays leave the bottom bracket and they go out almost pointing towards the ground. They're sort of pointing back, but they're down at an angle. Then they curve and they go up. Now this gives you the impression that the bike's going to have either a real high wheelbase or in terms of the wheels up, so your bottom bracket's going to be low. So either your rear wheel is going to be, your essentially that your bottom bracket is going to be lower, or that your rear wheel is going to be attached higher on the bike. In other words, actually, it's kind of deceiving. If you were to put like a straight line between here and here, you'll notice that it's not that dissimilar to normal chain stays. But what you get is a curvature effect where the chainstay curves and then goes like that, which is actually not dissimilar to the curvature of a fork blade. The reason that fork blades, for many, many, many years, and some still are, have a curvature in them, is because of the way the curvature directs force and causes the fork blades to flex. The fork blade on, let's say, a steel road frame, for example, that has a slight curve to it, that directs force to flex in that direction. It's kind of like the curvature on a bow. If you're an archer, you're familiar with different bows have different types of curves. A long bow just curves straight back, a recurve curves straight back and then goes like this, etc. Well, a curvature to the fork of a bicycle allows it to flex. I'm not entirely sure that this was done to allow the bike to have more flex in its rear triangle, but indeed there's a little sticker here that says Max Mudroom, indicating that perhaps the idea was to provide some kind of greater clearance. But the thing is that this does potentially give you the ability for the frame to maybe absorb bumps a little more comfortably, sort of like how a front fork is springy. And you'll notice, of course, that on really early road bikes, a lot of the forks are a lot more curved. That was essentially to create more flex. Now this could also, as the sticker suggests, max mudroom, be about providing clearance either for wider tires and mud if you're riding with dirt on your tires, or that sort of thing. This bike did originally come with fairly wide tires. You've got a 2-inch tire in the back and a 2.3 on the front, which I switched out for a tire that's about the same size as the rear, because sadly the front tire had a slit in it. And that was typically what you would do in the old days. You'd have a set of because you didn't have suspension, you'd have a set of, the biggest tires you could get your hands on that would fit in the frame. And you'd have a slightly wider one in the front. But, I'm not entirely sure whether the goal of this is to provide curvature so you can get flex, whether the goal of it is in fact to provide maybe a little more clearance, whether the goal of it is in fact to affect simply how force is transmitted, how the frame flexes or doesn't flex from the pedaling. You'll be familiar, if you're a roadie, with the asymmetrical Pinarello carbon frames. The whole theory behind that is that they wanted the bike to react to the flex, not of roadway obstacles and bumps on the surface of the road as you're riding, but the flex generated by the force being applied to the pedals in the bottom bracket. And of course, since that flex is going to be transmitted differently, since the drivetrain is only on one side, that necessitated an asymmetrical design in their mind. Now, it is worth noting, by the way, you see this with some mountain bikes, dual suspension mountain bikes in particular. If you look at my Kona Dog, for example, the rear triangle is different on one side than the other. I don't know, I haven't consulted the Kona engineers, but my belief is that much like the Pinarello asymmetrical road bikes, is probably to compensate for the difference in force between the drive side and the non-drive side. Since one of the big problems with dual suspension bikes is trying to eliminate the bobbing and the waste of energy that's created by pedaling, and that causing the bike to sort of bounce up and down. And I have seen that with other dual suspension frames as well. Some of them are, not all, but some are asymmetrical when it comes to the chainstays, particularly around the bottom bracket area. You do sometimes see that with rigid frames, though. The early Merlin titanium mountain bikes I've seen on one of their early hardtails, that had asymmetrical stays. So there you go. Now these stays are not asymmetrical, but they are, although they're symmetrical, they're very different than standard ones in terms of, rather than just going like this, they curve down, they go up, it's weird. It's very odd. And it's actually reminiscent of another bike that was made by makers at this time. One of them, I think, even by Univega, the Alien frame, which had an elevated chainstay that actually never went down to the bottom bracket, but attached somewhere up here. Interesting design choice. Not sure why they did that. Other companies as well did that. I once saw an early trying to remember if it was an Aegis or a Kestrel. I think it was, I honestly don't remember, but an early carbon fiber mountain bike that was actually a rigid mountain bike, oddly enough, that had the same type of design. I actually saw that for sale on Craigslist. If only I had money, right? Well, but here's the thing. This unusual design, it's not just the stays, it's not just the down tube, it's not just up here, it's not just the head tube, it's the entire bike. This isn't just a question of, well, this bike's got a couple features. it's that this entire bike is sort of, well, it embodies everything that was going on in that time period. And if you weren't around for it, the 1990s were a wonderful period in cycling where people were trying new things and companies were actually getting creative and trying to respond to the market. And in some cases, taking their cues, horror of horrors, not from marketing gurus, but from their customers and what their customers said that they'd be interested in actually riding. And sometimes, in fact, they would look at things that customers had tinkered with and put together themselves and said, hey, let's make a production version of that. And because they had yet to standardize on what mountain biking should look like and what mountain bikes should look like, it was kind of like there were no rules in that sense. Anything goes. Nowadays, if you have certain designs that deviate from what the industry accepts as well as the standard, they're not going to sell. They'll just die out. You know, they become either something with a small cult following or they go extinct. Back in the 1990s, especially the early or mid 1990s, it was a different time. The industry hadn't agreed what a mountain bike should look like. So people were coming up with all kinds of unusual designs and unusual things. And it really was a case of, people were free to pursue different solutions to the same problem. And it really gave you a lot of choices, a lot of options, and essentially the method by which the industry was moving forward was a method that was, philosophically consistent with what cycling is supposed to be about, and mountain biking in particular, often seen as, where the free spirits go. Well, nowadays the cycling industry is so closed-minded and so shut off, and so, if you were to take a lot of these people and send them back to the mid-1990s, I think they would have heart attacks. I really do. But it was a wonderful time to be involved in this and to be riding and to be exploring the world on a bike. And these bikes still have a lot to offer because they're old a lot of times, but they're not old enough to be classic. It's not like a 1981 stump jumper or 1983 stump jumper or something like that. So people look at this and they say, you know what? It's just an old bike, right? Now you're starting to find more and more following for these, but it's still not the way it is with the really vintage stuff where people look at it and think, that's a classic, right? To a lot of people, these are just old. And because of that, you can a lot of times pick them up cheaper and yada yada. Like I said, that's sort of changing slowly, but it's still true for a lot of things. However, because they're old, they are a lot of times overlooked, and people figure they have nothing to offer. And that's not true. There's a lot they have to offer. So we can start with the fact that they have different features that were designed at a different time, but those features were attempts to solve problems that still exist today. How's the bike going to go over varying terrain? How do we balance, sturdiness with lightweight? All of these things are considerations that people are still trying to address today. In some cases, they've given up trying to address, like with the weight issue. Nowadays, the idea seems to be just make the bike as sturdy as possible and to hell with how it handles. Now, to be fair, we also have, many more gears on a lot of our modern bikes, so we can slog it up the hill if we have to, even if the bike is excessively heavy. But I guess the point is, why make your bike excessively heavy, right? It's, would you design a sword that had a poor point of balance and that handled like crap, and that was about as useful a weapon as a sledgehammer, just because, well, hey, it'll never break in combat? Yeah, but you only get one swing before you're skewered because you'll never be able to redirect the strike, parry with it, guard with it, defend with it, etc. And some swords handle worse than others, but somebody who's into historical arms and armor, I can make the analogy. a modern mountain bike sometimes is like a sledgehammer. The bikes from this era handle like, you know, a lightweight dueling sword or something, right? Or a military saber or, you know, something along those lines. And the truth is they're much more versatile. A bike like this, because it's fairly lightweight and has either no travel or minimal travel, this one has none. It's a rigid frame, completely rigid frame. They're very useful for riding if you're going to be doing multiple, you know, on the street, off-road, dirt road, that sort of thing. In fact, some of these can make extremely useful, basically like, you know, backcountry touring bikes. And some of the rigid ones, yes, you can put drop bars on them or mustache bars if you want, or you can just run them the way they are, you know, just maybe a slightly more elevated stem or something. I personally like these for moderate off-roading, whether it's, you know, dirt roads or hardback single track. I have been trying to get out more on one of these as far as actually riding, you know, real off-road mountain bike trails, but the problem is that it's just been so rainy of late. I think this past week is the past week we've only had one thunder shower, you know, so it only rained one day of the week, but it's been so rainy and muddy that it's been hard to get out. So I haven't really. I went off-roading on a rigid frame. Since I said I was going to do that, I've only been able to go off-roading on a rigid frame like twice. But then again, I've only been off-roading twice because of the rain. So both times we're on a rigid frame. So, you know, still working on that. It's dependent on trail access, and we basically have none where I live because the government's run by a bunch of arseholes. But the thing about this is that because, like I said, it's an older bike, they do get overlooked, but they do have a lot to offer. Yeah, you're not going to be going off 6-foot drops on this, but who the hell does that anyway, right? What you're going to be doing is you're going to be finding yourself with a bike that is really light, really nimble, really easy to handle, and yeah, you might have to be a little more careful about how you ride over obstacles, but that's called skill, you know. Obviously, it takes skill to go over big drops, but it's a different type of skill with a different type of application. The point here is that this bike is designed to not just be used for stunts. It's designed to actually be ridden. And it has a lot to offer in our modern times, despite being old and anachronistic. And again, because the weird features on this bike and bikes like it from this time period were attempts to answer problems about the interaction between the bicycle and the physical world that still exists to this day if you're going to be trying to ride a bicycle off-road. They have some surprising things to offer you because, it's not the answer you get from the modern bike industry, but that's kind of the point, right? So I love these old bikes, and you know, don't get me wrong, I also am very glad they invented suspension, but I do find myself riding these more and more. Especially for lighter off-roading, again, you know, like dirt roads or moderate single track. And there is a lot to be said for these. So that's just a little bit about this Univega 503. And just word about Univega, it's interesting. Specialized is known for the first production mountain bike in the United States. They basically purchased one of Tom Ritchie's bikes, sent it overseas, and had it reverse engineered. The result was the Specialized Stump Jumper, which came out in the early 80s. Univega is known for basically being the second people to have a mass-produced mountain bike. So, you know, they were right there in the beginning, and like a lot of bike companies that were once great, their name is now associated with department store crap, if people remember it at all. Companies like Schwinn, Mongoose, etc., that have gone the way of the dodo. But this was a part of mountain bike history. Univega was a part of mountain bike history, and part of the history of cycling generally, of course, you know, connections to Univega and some really neat road bikes back in the day as well. Long story short, if you can get your hands on one of these, you will not regret it. They're pretty darn cool. They're not going to handle like a modern bike, but they're not supposed to. Won't ride her out. Rock on, ride safe.